This brings us to talking a little bit about the learning process. How do people learn things, anything? And so we'll talk a little bit about some learning theory, some kind of academic theories, and then really get into how do we take that and translate it into instructional strategies that use the learning process in order to create effective instruction. So we'll start talking a little bit about learning theory. So we've got kind of two historical learning theories over the years, and the first one that you see there on the left, behaviorism, it's a school of thought that attempts to explain animal and human behavior in terms of responses to stimuli, right? So classic behaviorism talks about rewards and punishments. This is sort of your carrot and stick method. And behaviorism has been found more appropriate really for training than for teaching. And if you're wondering what the difference is, you can train your dog to retrieve a ball, right? But you can't really teach them like why or how. When you get into flight training or flight teaching, flight instruction, the training side, that's really kind of your part tasks, right? Your execution of specific physical tasks, holding a precise hover, executing a landing approach, whatever it is, those tasks that are much more physical and have a very specific, this is just kind of what you do, right? So those can be approached from that behaviorism mentality where you're essentially rewarding certain specific behaviors or routines, or not rewarding, punishing. It's probably not really the right phrase in flight training, but not rewarding those bad habits and trying to correct them. This theory, this behaviorism idea, is not considered effective for teaching students complex concepts, right? You can't carrot and stick your way into someone developing good decision making. This brings us to cognitive theory. This is as we've kind of advanced over the years in teaching philosophy and ideas. The cognitive theory places an emphasis on what's going on in your mind while you're learning this process, and that's based on a premise that learning is not just conditioning and change in behavior like we saw with behaviorism. Instead, it's a changing in the way that you think or understand or how you feel about something. And this places an emphasis on the mental state and mental events of the learner. So cognitive theory brought us these concepts of critical thinking and problem solving, these things that you don't really do very well with that carrot and stick. So within cognitive theory, we talk about information processing theory, this subset that uses a computer as a model for how humans learn and draws parallels from the way humans process information, store it, recall it, and generate responses, generate activity from that information. And it breaks the primary process into these ideas of encoding, retaining, and retrieving. But it doesn't really account for some of the complexities, the fallibilities of the human brain, right? Your brain is not a computer. You do not just store data in ones and zeros that can be recalled. It's a more complex process. And as is pretty well known, memory is a little bit fallible and not always trustworthy. You look at kind of eyewitness statements and you can have 5 people see the same event and all give 5 different accounts of how it happened. But this information processing theory does provide us kind of tools for understanding how we develop unconscious processes and how we execute what we'll talk about later is the simultaneous performance type of multitasking. And so lastly, constructivism, another kind of subset within that cognitive theory that is a derivative describing learning as an active process of building knowledge and skills over time based on the experience of the learner. And this is really where we anchor for the learning process in aviation, in teaching and instructing in aviation. It supposes that people construct this mental image by taking new information via the senses and combining it with previously known information. So you're always building, new things are always building on the old things, these building blocks. And we'll talk about building block theory a little bit later on. Each new iteration of this process builds more of the image, makes a more complete picture. And you can think about it as, assembling a jigsaw puzzle without having the box cover, right? You just have a bag full of pieces And at first, all you're really doing is starting to connect pieces, that either obviously go together by their shape or their color or their pattern. And you're not trying to build a bigger picture. You're just finding things that go together. But the more of that information that you put together, the more of those pieces you assemble, you start to be able to see the image, right? You start to see the picture, and that makes it easier to find more pieces. You start to see, oh, this is a house or a river or a tree or, whatever is in your puzzle, and that starts to accelerate the process. Each new piece that you look at, you start to have a better idea of where it fits in the overall picture, because you're adding these pieces based on what you already know about it, what's already in the image. And it encourages learners to seek these connections and find ways to build out from what's known, to take those pieces of the puzzle that you've already found that fit together and find more and more pieces to build onto it until you have the final picture. And this isn't a good strategy for learning simple physical tasks like throwing a baseball or holding a hover, but it is essentially the only way to learn the more advanced techniques and what we call higher order thinking skills, or HOTS. So what are higher order thinking skills? So higher order thinking skills, this is a derivative of that constructivist theory of learning, and it's focused on the top 3 echelons of Bloom's taxonomy of learning. And we'll talk a little bit more about those bottom steps, right? But we can see these top 3 steps here: analysis, synthesis, evaluation. And that's critical to the development of things like judgment, decision-making, critical thinking. In order to move from the simpler categories into more complex ones, we use problem-based learning. And this gives the learner a context, right? Talking about that, building that puzzle, this helps to provide ways in which your student in the aircraft can start to put those pieces together. And to learn these thinking skills. In order to facilitate moving from the simple to the complex and the known to the unknown, we want to use authentic and real-world problems to aid students in understanding the practical framework for these skills. So we focus on active learning strategies that put students in the position of seeking and developing knowledge as opposed to being fed it. So this is I think where some of those instructional strategies we talked about at the beginning, kind of the classic Navy throw the book, whether that's the NATOPS or the MDG or the FTI, at a student and say, figure it out. That was probably where that idea came from, but it's woefully misapplied, right? So we want students to take an active role in their learning as opposed to just being given the information. But there are ways to do it well, to do it correctly. So we want to use cooperative learning strategies. This is why you see students do better on events where you have multiple students on one event, whether that's a couple of cards, pilot and air crewman cards together on a flight. If students are learning together and they're developing these skills, they're bouncing ideas off of each other, it improves the overall learning quality. And it's important to remember that you have to work up through these levels, and we'll talk more about Bloom's taxonomy in a little bit, in order to give students that subject matter knowledge to build on, right? So knowledge, comprehension, application, you have to start with the knowledge, right? And that is that level that we expect students to start from, to break open their pubs, to know, whether it's systems, basic tactics, source pubs, the SEAWOLF manual, to start from that core level. They have to have the knowledge, they have to know the facts in order for you to teach them these higher order thinking skills and how to think about problems. You can't just jump straight into analysis or synthesis if your student isn't able to apply the information that they know, or for that matter, they don't know or comprehend the information to begin with. But it's important to emphasize HOTS, these higher order thinking skills, throughout the curriculum so that students understand that's what they're working towards, right? They're working towards being an aircraft commander, being a section lead, being a division lead, where it's those knowledges, right? The ability to apply the basic knowledge of the aircraft and the tactics, that's a given. That's the baseline. What you're really working on is your ability to apply it, right? Whether that's as an aircraft commander, a section lead, division lead, whatever it is, to execute that decision making and have good judgment. Like, how do you teach someone to have good judgment, right? There is a method to it. This is the method.